Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to instruct you on how you can submit any questions through today's presentation. At the bottom of your screen, if you hover over the presentation, there is going to be a control bar that has a Q&A portion. You can click the box, submit your question, and we will be reserving time at the end of today's presentation to answer them. Today's webinar is focused on improving SOC efficiency with deception. Our hosts today are our Director of Solution Architecture, Chad Gassaway, and our featured guest, Joseph Blankenship, a Principal Analyst with Forrester Research. Joe, we're going to start with you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. If you want to go on to the next slide. All right. So if you're not familiar, whoa, okay. No, we're good. Yeah, if you're not familiar with Forrester, what we are is a large research company. One of the things that we focus on is cybersecurity. So we work with a lot of vendors like Illusive Networks. We also work with end user customers like all of you on the webinar here today to help them with strategy. We'll help them with buying decisions, help them understand how the environment is changing. Next slide, please. So some of the coverage that I've got as part of my role at Forrester are things like artificial intelligence, technologies for security operations centers, things like security analytics platforms, automation platforms, SOC processes. How do we get better at doing what we do in the SOC and with our security operations? Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of what I'm going to cover today, just a brief agenda here. I'm going to walk through a little bit of survey research from our Forrester, our annual Forrester security survey that we do. We do a lot of surveys at Forrester, being a research company. One of them, obviously, being a cybersecurity survey that goes out globally. So we'll share some of the results from that. We'll also talk about some of the things that are causing us to be not so efficient in the SOC, and then get into what can we do to improve that efficiency, what technology solutions and what process solutions are out there to improve efficiency. Then I'll wrap up and I'll hand off to Chad to walk us through the rest of the presentation. Next slide, please. All right, so data breaches and causes. If we just go on to the next slide. All right, so out of our survey from 2018, over half the firms we surveyed indicated they were breached in the past 12 months. Most of those were external attacks. You can kind of see there on the right how that broke down. Largely software exploits, web application attacks, and stolen credentials, where attackers were getting into environments and being able to exfiltrate data. We also saw about 23% of those breaches being caused by internal attacks, where over half of those were people internally that were acting maliciously. 38% were just accidental issues, usually people trying to circumvent policy or trying to get something done, that type of thing. And then you can kind of see how that trickles out to third parties being breached, as well as lost or stolen assets, like leaving the proverbial leaving the laptop in the cab, or nowadays obviously the Uber, etc. Next slide, please. So what kind of data are we talking about, right? It's usually the things that we're most concerned about, and especially have some compliance concerns around. Things like PII, personally identifiable information, number one. Number two on this list, intellectual property, has kind of steadily gone up this list over the past couple of years. And one of the things that's really concerning, to me about intellectual property theft is, a lot of this is the result of nation-state type attackers, right? Or at least state-sponsored type attackers, whether targeting organizations, stealing their IP. If you think about intellectual property, it's not regulated, right? So we don't really have a regulatory requirement to protect intellectual property, but what we do have is a requirement to protect it, because now we're protecting our future revenues as a company, right? This is what we've invested money in, so we can generate money in the future, or revenues for our company in the future. And then of course things like PCI data, account numbers, and authentication credentials. Authentication credentials being really key for attackers that want to be able to carry out further attacks or act as if they are a trusted user and get into an environment. Next slide, please. So one of the other things that we see with these breaches, right, is a lot of times they can last a really long time. So if we think about the Marriott breach that was disclosed last year, that breach dated back to, it started in 2014, so it was active for about 4 years. When you think about having attackers active in your environment for that kind of a time, they can do a lot of damage. Next slide, please. And that's one of the things that we're here talking about a bit today, right? We're talking about SOC inefficiency. We're talking about not being able to see this attack activity because we're kind of being inundated with alerts and inundated with data that we've got to sift through to make good decisions. So if you kind of think about if an attacker has an average of 197 days to carry out their attack, exfiltrate data, et cetera, that's what's leading to a lot of these really large breaches. All right, next slide, please. And we also polled our survey respondents and asked them, what are your biggest security challenges? The number one for the last few years has been complexity, the complexity of the IT environment. Kind of, if you think about hybrid environments, multi-cloud environments, applications spinning up, virtualized environments, these are all things that are still, even at this stage of the game, relatively new for security teams. The business tends to be moving at a much faster pace than in the past. And so a lot of the ways that we approach security in the past are no longer able to keep up, to be quite honest. One of the big pieces there is automating a lot of our infrastructure and applications and workloads. As we're automating all those activities, we're still trying to do things manually in security, and it just doesn't. We can't keep up. The day-to-day tactical activity, spending a lot of time doing minutia in security, probably not having enough people, being understaffed, right, and not having the people with the right skills to do the job effectively. So next slide, please. So let's get into SOC inefficiencies and kind of what we're talking about here. So as I mentioned, security analysis is very much a manual activity today. We expect our SOC analysts to go through a lot of information, make determinations, and doing a lot of this manually. Typically you see some of the productivity tools in the SOC being things like Notepad or Excel, not necessarily the most advantageous things for doing things at a very fast pace. Next slide. The other thing that happens is we're sending a lot of information to our analysts and asking them to make those decisions very quickly, which can lead to just overlooking things that might be important, perhaps not even getting to something that could be indicative of an attack, perhaps just making a mistake. Because we've got maybe 5 minutes to look at an incident, determine whether or not it's real, and then whether or not we should spend more time investigating that incident. So it leads to some of these attack activities going unseen for a long time. Next slide, please. So problem one, too many alerts. So I'm probably a little older than most of the people on this call, but there was a show called I Love Lucy, and there's this wonderful episode where Ethel, there on the left, and Lucy there on the right, working in a chocolate factory, right? They're thinking this is a great job, and all of a sudden all these candies come shooting down the chute really fast, and they're trying to eat the candy because they can't move fast enough, right, to put it in the box and do stuff. If you have never seen it, YouTube it. Awesome, very funny episode. I kind of use this image, though, to think about or kind of equate that to a SOC analyst being, pulling up a dashboard, looking at it, seeing a whole ton of incidents and not really knowing sometimes where to start the day, or having so many things to respond to that perhaps they can't get to everything. So you have to have a way to triage these, all of these alerts, and we have to have a way to be really smart about doing so. Next slide, please. So problem two, we kind of mentioned, not being able to find the staff, right? We don't have enough people who are trained to understand security and to be really efficient in operating. It's something we hear, quite a bit from, from our end user customers, is they just can't find and retain the people that they need. So that kind of exacerbates problem one. Next slide, please. And then problem three, we have a ton of security tools. As we found a problem, there's a vendor that has spun up a company to address that problem. And so what we end up with is a really heterogeneous kind of environment where we've got all of these tools operating at different levels of efficiency and efficacy, right? And all of our SOC operators cannot be expert in all of these different tools. And so we've got all of this stuff providing information into the SOC. Next slide, please. Because we kind of look at this too as being kind of an expense in depth model. It's sort of a play on words with the old defense in depth, kind of concept, right? We keep buying all of this stuff to address all of these little point problems. Next slide, please. And we all know that the more tools that we have, that means we're getting more alerts from all of those tools. And we have to make determinations very quickly about what is this stuff telling us in order to be efficient. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about improving efficiency, right? So we're going to walk through a couple of different solutions for improving our SOC efficiency. So solution one, let's reduce the threat surface, which sounds really easy when you're an analyst doing a webinar and saying that, right? One of the ways that we approach that at Forrester is, our zero trust framework. If you're not familiar with the zero trust framework, definitely look that up. Google it. Visit our blog site. There's a few great blogs out there about zero trust that can kind of give you a flavor for what we're talking about if you're not familiar. But sort of the original tenet of zero trust is we want to build our protections around the things that are important to protect, and that's our critical assets and our critical data. So we talked about the data types that were breached. That's what we're talking about. Build our protections around that data and limit the access to that data. And what that allows us to do from a SOC standpoint is to say, when we see activity or malicious, or suspicious activity targeting, these assets, this network segment, this data, et cetera, now we can prioritize that. We can respond to it much more quickly. Another piece of this is if we understand where our critical assets, where our critical data is, we can also do some work to understand how can an attacker gain access to this information, and we can kind of walk backwards. What would that look like? What would the different attack scenarios be? Gives us a way too to kind of prioritize whether or not we think an attack could be on or off target, right? If we actually think, kind of look at a series of alerts and say, hey, we're getting this kind of an alert, but we don't believe that this is an actual legitimate threat, to this data, and also we can also block this traffic, right? We make the decision to block this person. And then lastly, of course, leveraging the zero trust framework to limit and monitor access. So for limiting, the access to things that are critical, the things that we really want to protect, and we're also monitoring the traffic or the users that are trying to access that information. Now we have a really rich set of context that we can provide a security analyst to make a quick decision about whether or not to stop an activity. The next slide, please. So solution two, risk prioritized alerts. So we talked about, a little bit, hey, let's understand what our critical assets are, understand what our critical data is, and we also want to understand the attack path to those assets, to that data, right? That also gives us now the ability to prioritize our alerts based on risk, the sensitivity of the asset or the data that's being targeted, the confidence we have that an attack could succeed. We can actually build these into our models to say, if we see this kind of activity, now we're going to say this is now a critical alert. This is why we want to spend our time. We want our analysts to go spend time studying this, because now we have a higher level of confidence that this is, you know, something that's on target, targeting really critical information. That way we can focus our resources on the higher priority, high likelihood events that may be occurring. It also allows us to use automation to triage some of those events and gather context, so we're able to conduct our investigations in a more automated format, as opposed to doing all this manual analysis. We kind of understand attack paths, we understand the assets, we understand our business environment. Now we can start building automations that allow us to pull all this information together and make our, you know, in essence, make our analysts smarter, make them more efficient in terms of the work that they're doing, not doing it quite as many manual tasks, but presenting that information to them, giving them more information to make a decision on. Next slide, please. So focus investigations on the things that are really high confidence and high risk. Next slide. And that also means that we need better context in the alerts that we get from all of these security tools. We have to provide rich context about the event to the analyst. You know, what was the asset? What was the data that's at risk from a particular attack activity? Is that asset vulnerable to that attack? You know, different, if you're targeting, you know, an asset with a type of malware or an attack that we can recognize, and we can say we're patched against this particular attack, that's not necessarily a priority at that point. We certainly want to investigate who is doing that and try to stop it. But we can also make the determination this may not be our most critical event right now. We can focus our resources on things that are more critical. We want it, but that requires us to have that information about the attack method. We need to pull in intelligence, you know, threat intelligence, indicators of compromise, et cetera, to inform our SOC response. We need to put that in front of our analysts. If we're asking the analyst to make a quick decision, do we investigate? Do we close the incident? Do we take an action to stop what we're seeing? We have to provide that information, the needed information to the analyst about what action they should take as a next step. Next slide. Solution 4, automate response. And I know this is still a little bit controversial, probably not as controversial as it was just a couple of years ago, as we're getting much more comfortable with automating things at security operations, right? But using analytics and automation to automatically respond and kind of basing that on the criticality of an event as well as the confidence level of the event. Kind of look at the graphic there. We're using security analytics to determine the attack, the confidence level. We have, you know, hey, is this a real attack or a false positive? Is this attack on target for the asset that it's targeting? And then we want to be able to trigger an action. And one of the things about automation and automating this kind of response is we can really target that automated response. So we're maybe not making a widespread, sort of an action that could be impact the enterprise. Instead, we may do something like just force a password reset. Force a multi-factor authentication. We may want to isolate the user or the asset, so we can, maybe do a scan of that of the machine where we're seeing traffic coming from to make sure that it's not infected with anything or not vulnerable to something, right? So we can, take these kind of finite actions automatically that allow us to protect our data and give the analyst, more time to go and investigate what's really happening and get to root cause, right? Next slide. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here. So all this infrastructure complexity is certainly stressing our security pros. Our limited number of security pros are trained, experienced security pros, and we have to be able to keep up with this evolving infrastructure, the way that the rest of our business is evolving. That means that we can't continue doing everything the same way we've done it for the last 20 years in security. We have to have speed and agility in our security operations to stop these large breaches. The average of 197 days for an attacker to live and dwell inside of a network or an environment has really got to stop. That means
JB, did we lose you? All right, with that, we're going to move to Chad's slide. Mr. Gasaway, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chad Gasaway. I'm the Director of Solutions Architecture for Illusive Networks. Thank you for taking the time to join our webinar. To add to what JB was saying in the Forrester slides there, obviously we've invested significant amounts of money in various security controls as well as infrastructure devices. In fact, there's all kinds of devices that generate all types of information that we then have to sort through to really, find the signal in the noise. So within the top of this funnel, there's a number of devices from a security standpoint that's generating security events. Those are intermixed with other devices that are generating events that you would expect, successful logins, or the fact that access was granted, or the fact that access is there, even disabled logins. And a lot of these events are meaningful. Some of these are meaningless, in which case we do have to kind of sort through these millions of events that occur on an ongoing basis. This is streaming into our environment. And through correlation, using our SIMs and other tools that we have at our disposal, we're going to distill those down to millions of events that matter. Now, what oftentimes happens is that we don't quite know what got missed, right? So when we're looking at the things at the top of the funnel, there's things that look perfectly legitimate, when in fact it could be a part of a larger story of things that are taking place into the environment. So as we correlate through these events, we eventually get down to just a few thousands, and then based on prioritization and other things that we might do to kind of get to the stuff that matters, we start to analyze the few that mean the most to us, right? The few that we want to make sure that it is categorized properly or applied to the appropriate severity. But the time that it takes to get to this point is oftentimes very significant. It could take as many as several weeks. It could take hours. But it really depends on how mature our response capabilities actually are, and how talented our team is. And as you're well aware, it is very difficult to find strong talent to add to our security teams to analyze this data very quickly and get to the meaningful results. Now, where Illusive comes in, next slide. Where Illusive comes in is that we provide the detection early in the attack lifecycle. And the idea here is to actually provide something that's so early in the attack lifecycle, near patient zero, and that it's not based on whether or not there was a brute force attack or a number of failed password attempts. It's not based on any sort of signatures or anything that we would traditionally look for. It's not based on behaviors, tools, tactics, and techniques. What we want to do is we want to impact the decision-making process. Every attacker, when engaging an environment, has to make decisions based on information. And so we want to impact that. And what that does is allows us to provide detection not only early in the attack lifecycle, sometimes on patient zero, but it immediately allows us to prioritize what's taking place and then start to correlate things in reverse. So what we want to do is looks like we have some panelists that are saying the webinar link is slow. But we also want to make sure that in this detection, we improve the confidence. So it starts off with really understanding what our environment looks like, right? We want to make sure that we understand what the connection relationships are. What are the pathways that the attacker might take to get to those items of significance within our environment? This is oftentimes an area where we do not have very much visibility. We don't oftentimes even know how many systems in our environment would be important to the business. We have an idea of a few systems that would be crown jewels, but what about systems with high concentrations of connectivity, right? What about systems that have cache connection information or cache credential data that could be used to naturally navigate the business without really yielding an alert that you would traditionally flag on? So the idea here, looks like there's no voice. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. So the idea here is to identify what items the attacker might use in this environment, and then at that point, start to make decisions on how we can effectively apply security controls and policy to better protect these critical assets, but also how we can control levels of access to these resources and ensure that certain credentials are not just cached or orphaned in this environment, leaving these opportunities for the attacker that's out there. Okay, so the next step is we then want to start to map out how many lateral movements it would take from patient zero to get to a crown jewel. We want to make sure that we understand that so that we can then start to augment those pathways or apply additional controls to ensure that those pathways are not present at all times. Go ahead and build out the next one, please. So the next step is it's important to understand, okay, at what point in our environment, how pervasive is administrative privilege credentials used in our environment? Are these permissions applied to the correct users? Where are these users located? Are they following proper protocol and procedure in logging off of RDP sessions and other types of sessions that may leave these credentials orphaned on these machines? Once we understand where all these resources are actually located, what we want to do now is at that point make sure that we take the opportunity to recognize those, remove privileges where it makes sense, but also take steps to actually remediate these problems and so that the attacker doesn't have these available in their lateral movements. Next slide. So the next step is to either isolate or trigger once we have identification. So as you can see here, we're going to first make sure that within the product, we're going to define what systems matter most to the business. Now we can do this both in an automated fashion, but we can also do this in collaboration with the customer to determine, hey, these are the systems that matter most. If the attacker were to gain access to these crown jewels, it could do irreparable harm to the business. The next step is, since we now know what systems mean the most, and we have some context in the organization on what matters most, what we want to do is to determine what are the pathways within 5 degrees of separation, what are the pathways that exist based on the persistent cached information that exists in these machines that would allow an attacker to navigate from the first machine all the way into the crown jewel that we flag, or the systems that we flag as crown jewels. Now, something else that is also considered a crown jewel would be any machine in the organization that might have a cached connection artifact or a cached credential with privileges, right, or administrative privileges. Those machines also would be very important to the business, and that's automatically discovered by Illusive, and we would provide this exact same pathway information that would then allow you to actually understand how an attacker might make it to those resources. Go ahead and advance. So the next step is what this actually allows you to do is say, if I have an incident, no matter what the tool is that you use to detect an attacker's activity, if I have an incident on a machine, I now know what the degrees of separation are from this machine to a crown jewel. And in the case of lateral movements, which is the #1 way that the attacker navigates the business environment, oftentimes doing so quietly, then that allows you to prioritize these incidents based on risk, right? And I can then start to make a more rapid decision on how I want to engage this adversary. Now, what Illusive will also allow you to do is you can also add this information or add this to a cleanup queue. Meaning, once we've identified what these pathways are through rules that we develop, you can then at that point automatically across the organization make sure on an ongoing basis that these pathways don't exist. So anytime we identify within 5 degrees of separation, so anywhere from 1 to 5, anytime we identify a pathway to a crown jewel that should not be there, or a credential that's cached on a system that is orphaned, that doesn't have any active session information with it, without disrupting the business, without actually impacting user interaction, we can then remove these pathways from the environment, making the environment less opportunistic for the attacker. And again, this is all a part of hygiene. This is all a part, just like we're doing things like patch management and vulnerability assessments and things of that sort. This is part of the process, understanding what's out there, what's available to the attacker in terms of cache connection information so that they can't live off the land. And then at that point, augmenting or removing those pathways so that they don't have easy ways to navigate to our most critical assets. Next slide. So the next step is, okay, now that we have an understanding of what this environment looks like, we want to make sure now that the environment's now hostile to the decision-making process. Now, what I mean by this is that oftentimes we'll apply two-factor authentication and various types of secure controls to make things harder for an attacker to use. But the attacker, we're dealing with an attacker that's opportunistic, right? Meaning they don't see what we take away from them. What they do see is what's available to them. So they'll try things out and they'll look at the information. They'll go to make decisions based on that cached information. And then at that point, that's where we want to engage them. So in every single endpoint in the environment, we want to take the information that we've identified in that environment, the cache data that exists on a machine. This information, by the way, is created just by the users doing their daily job function. So when they sign into Windows and they go to access their various applications, they're going to create these historical records of connectivity. Then what we want to do is not only pull back those legitimate pathways to crown jewels, but introduce deceptive information into the environment so that when the attacker goes to observe the environment and orient themselves within that environment, that they're falsely oriented and they no longer have a clear understanding of what the environment actually looks like. They cannot tell the difference between what's real and what's not, and then their decision-making process is permanently impacted because of the information being poisoned. Right? So the idea here is to impact the decision-making process no matter where they might be. Go ahead and advance the slide. No matter where they might be, whether they establish one beachhead or 1,000 beachheads, the moment they go to make a decision to move to the next machine and use a credential to authenticate to that next machine, you now have a detection, and the defense now has the ability to control the probabilities of successfully detecting the attacker much earlier in the attack lifecycle. Go ahead and advance the slide again, please. Now, the next step here is let's also do this across the other tools that you have in your environment. So, for example, you have detections. The attacker might introduce tools and tactics or other types of things that your other tool sets might actually detect as well. So now what we want to do is also offer meaningful intelligence based on the event that came from the other tool. Go ahead and advance the slide, please. And what that means is that we're going to issue on any event, elusive event or events that come from other tools, a forensic response immediately to the endpoint in question. So oftentimes forensics is engaged later in the attack lifecycle. Once you've identified things that they've done successfully, what we're doing is impacting a decision-making process and issuing a forensic response at the moment they're engaged in this activity, and then extending this capability out to other tools that you might have, other detection capabilities that you might have, whether it be correlation through your SIM or other EDR solutions or even your EDA and other tools, that you can then reach out to the Illusive API and issue a forensic response to the offending endpoint or server in that moment in time. Next slide, please. Right. So now what we're talking about here is actually streamlining the incident handling process. Instead of dumping a lot of events, which you're going to do, right? You're going to add events to the top of the funnel. You're still going to sort through those events, but what we want to do is we want to flip this on its head a bit and actually focus on things specifically that are early in the attack lifecycle that we understand all attackers have to go through, but also understand this from the context of what this means in terms of risk to the business and an attacker making it to a crown jewel, and then we can do correlation backwards from that point of focus. We can now start to go from a very focused point and find all the events that relate to that focus point at that point. So with a verified incident, with a high confidence incident, we can now bypass the validation process. We can bypass the forensic collection process because we're doing that immediately at the point of impact when a decision is made. We're getting business with impact visibility very quickly simply because we have an understanding of what means most to the organization in terms of crown jewels and administrative privilege credentials and where they are. We can immediately move to triage, and we can rapidly adjust our controls and detection tools based on what we now understand about the business. We can also make adjustments to our security awareness practices to ensure that our users aren't just naturally introducing these kinds of risk elements into the environment. We can also streamline log mining, and then we can place an emphasis based on the intelligence that we've captured on threat hunting now. Through this information, we can now start to mine this forensic data, extract pertinent IOCs and TTPs from that forensic data earlier in the attack lifecycle, and apply that to our threat hunting practices. Right. So in a nutshell, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make it much faster, a much easier process to solve for lateral movements in a meaningful way by halting the attacker's ability to live off the land. We're trying to make sure that we improve alert prioritization by providing an understanding of what these alerts mean in the context of the crown jewels that exist in the environment, crown jewels being both systems that are meaningful to the organization as well as credential data. We want to accelerate the triage process, make sure that all the content data is taken into account that's relevant to an event earlier in the attack lifecycle, as far away from those crown jewels as humanly possible. And we want to start to respond on things based on risk focus across the SOC, just as the gentleman from Forrester mentioned earlier. So that concludes the presentation. If there's any questions, we certainly would love to take them. Thank you for your time.
JB and Chad, thank you very much. We did receive a few questions. So this one, JB, I think it's probably directed toward your portion of the presentation. When you were talking about automation, does that mean that you are automating the work that analysts are doing? And what might that mean for analyst jobs in the future? JB, it looks like you're still having some audio problems. We'll make sure to address that question in our post-webinar communications to all of our attendees today. Chad, we did receive a question about your comparison of deception to signature-based and IOC-based detection. But what about its comparison to behavioral analysis? How does the effectiveness of deception compare against UBEA anomaly detection?
Yeah, anomaly detection and UEBA is a fantastic solution. Their data sources, however, create some delays in which the detection occurs. Oftentimes, they rely on log data to effectively analyze that data to understand where the anomalies are. The baselining process also doesn't take into account active threats that already are in place. So if you go through a baselining process, you could potentially baseline things that are already active in the environment. But more importantly, I think the big difference between deception and, say, UEBA, for example, since there are overlapping use cases, is the accuracy and the fidelity of the alerts. Just based on what I've heard from customers and industry counterparts, there is a significant number of false positives that come out of just learning behavior in general over time. It just takes some time to really to hone that in and get more accurate and more confident alerts. For example, it's very difficult to kind of see when at what point you would be able to take automated action based on a UEBA alert, because it does require some investigation to make sure that that alert is indeed a positive. Compare and contrast that to deception. Deception is a little bit different. We're not looking to detect behavior, we're looking to influence behavior. We're looking to actually change the behavior of the attacker to the defense's favor by impacting their ability to make decisions, and we're going to do that in a manner that doesn't actually impact the user population. Meaning the deceptions are actually hidden from the end users. The attackers have to use their techniques and tool sets to actually find that information, and therefore what that means is that once that happens, you already have something interesting. You already have the forensic details to support that item, and therefore the alerts there's much more confidence in the alerts. Also keep in mind the benefit of deception is that an attacker cannot successfully move laterally using deception. That's not the case with UEBA, where the attacker can move laterally, and it's just we're hoping that we can detect abnormal behavior. So this is not a matter of a case where both solutions or one replaces the other. There is a need for both. But the idea here is to solve for lateral movements in a really meaningful way by dealing with the attackers that are living off the land, that are using your connection information and your credential data, that's following your ebbs and flows and the rules that are allowed within the business that oftentimes will not look anomalous, and do that by introducing information that they believe to be true, and therefore making them use that information and giving away their position. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Chad. We also received one very similar to that, wondering how the elusive attack paths relate to BAS breach and attack simulation platforms.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. Oftentimes, BAS solutions are actually leveraging agents and whatnot to simulate attacks back and forth between different nodes on the network. Very effective in identifying certain ways the attacker might go about navigating the business environment. In our experience, we haven't seen too many cases, and again, my sample set is somewhat limited with some of the newer ones like XM Cyber and other ones that are out there. But with some of the breach simulators that we've seen, they don't necessarily live off the land. They don't actually look for legitimate credentials that are on the endpoints that are users without administrative privileges that can be used to access adjacent resources. I mean, your perfectly legitimate users that are regular, have normal privileges can also move laterally. There are legitimate lateral movements in the environment. It's a natural part of doing business. What Illusive does, though, is we actually kind of separate what the legitimate lateral movements actually are from the business from the illegitimate lateral movement options. And that's a very different prospect, whereas the breach simulation solutions are looking for things more concrete, looking for things that are not necessarily related to the user's decision-making process. With Illusive, we're directly impacting the user's decision-making process, and what we found is that it's just a different perspective. Now, if you look at what's taken place in some of the breach reports, these attacks are occurring over extended periods of time, where the attackers are in these environments sometimes over 4 years. They don't do that by using the obvious methods or doing things in hours. These organizations had significant investments in security as well. What they're doing is they're using legitimate information and legitimate connection information is cached on these machines, as well as credential data that quietly move through the network. You're going to see successful logins in your SIEM. It's going to look perfectly normal. It's going to be during normal business hours. There's going to be a precedent set for these connections because this is cached connection information that exists on these machines. And so it's a very different perspective on this because we're dealing with the attacker that's using the information, your information against you, versus looking for vulnerability opportunities and other types of exploitation techniques to traverse the network.
Thanks, Chad. And JB, I believe we have you back on the line. Can we hear you?
I hope so.
Wonderful. We hear you loud and clear. So one other question that's probably for both you and Chad is you mentioning the problem of too many technologies in the SOC. Do you see people buying deception solutions to replace other tools? And if so, which ones?
Yeah, too many tools is certainly an issue as I covered in my portion of the presentation. And honestly, I think what I've seen for the most part is kind of the expense and depth model continuing, where I see deception being employed as another technology, which is sort of sitting beside a lot of the other stuff that they've got deployed. I think there's probably a lot of the end users that I've talked to that are in the testing phase on deception to see if they can replace some of their current network monitoring type tools with deception, or if this is going to be a net add that adds additional context to alerts, just as Chad was saying before, right? And I think that's a really key point that he brought up is enriching those SIEM alerts and making them more context heavy, so you can have higher confidence that what you're seeing is real. And I think kind of as they move through that and gain confidence with it, then that's probably the point that you'll start seeing that replacement path for more and more customers.
Chad, anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my experience, what we've seen in the marketplace is that this is identified as a gap in a security strategy. Now, I wouldn't say that there's a particular technology that we would replace. Certainly, that's something that customers are interested in. There's lots of technologies, as Joseph mentioned, that are coming out for every single issue that is out there. What we found from CISOs in terms of what they're telling us is that if we can solve for something meaningfully, trying to buy products for every single thing that's out there is unsustainable. It's a very expensive thing to do. It's very hard to maintain talent or hire talent to do all those things. And so what they're looking to do is to find things that can move the needle on the really critical items in security, both in terms of protecting the systems that mean the most to them, but also solutions that can provide a detection on an element of an attacker's procedure that could have a rippling effect across the security organization. Lateral movement happens to be a great place to do that, right? It happens, it's a critical part. Once an attacker lands in the environment, they're going to have to move laterally to do credential harvesting pervasively across the organization. They're going to have to move laterally in order to effectively, make it to a crown jewel and exfiltrate information. That stuff doesn't happen from a single machine, and it takes time. It takes a long amount of time, but there's malware and there's all kinds of techniques that the attackers might use to navigate hundreds of moves within a matter of moments. But as you can see, the kinds of breaches that we've seen in recent times, they're doing this over an extended period of time. So we need to shorten that dwell time. We need to reduce that down to patient zero within hours as opposed to within months. We need to provide valuable contextual information to our SOC team so they can know how to respond to these, and these types of items bubble up to the surface much faster, and they can provide some focus around that event, and then take that mountain of information and try to make sense of what took place at that moment in time. You also gain the benefit of, if you can detect this stuff early enough and stop it early enough on near patient zero, the amount of time that it takes for you to work your way back from that event to find the point of origin is significantly reduced. You're not moving back hundreds of machines after the attacker's already left. You're actually engaging an adversary at that moment in time while they're still there. So there's some benefit there. So I can't say that there's anything that we've replaced. We do have some CISOs that says, hey, I'm making the choice between UBA and deception at this time because I need to solve this problem, and I need to, time to value is very important to me. And they will oftentimes go with deception. But there's other use cases that UEBA makes sense for as well. So it really depends on the customer and where their priorities are. But right now, what we see is that this is a gap. This is an area where customers don't have a lot of capability in dealing with an attacker that's living off the land. And so this is something that they use for that.
Thank you, guys. The final question that we have time for today is from one of our audience members, wondering about how if our deception algorithms evolve over time, are we evolving patterns across our deployments?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
How do our deception algorithms evolve over time? Are we evolving patterns?
That's a fantastic question. So it's not based on pattern. It's based on the realities of the business. So when you do deception always has to mirror the business. If it doesn't mirror the business, then all of a sudden the attacker is now suspicious. And there's some inherent benefits with a suspicious attacker that can't trust the data. There's some pluses and minuses there. I'm happy to share that with you guys at a later time. But deception needs to mirror the business. So the business is going to organically change as you hire new people, as you introduce new applications, as you make changes to the organization, as you deprovision things, as you move from data centers to cloud. Those all institute changes to the organization. That deception has to take that into account. Now, if you can imagine, that's a lot of work to do that manually. So there's automation that needs to be used in order to effectively learn those changes and then represent the business accurately from a deception standpoint, right? And again, the objective here is to present the attacker with a reality that's based on the business, but not quite real, right? You want to make sure that their decision-making process is skewed towards deception rather than the legitimate data. And you do that both with hygiene, removing the legitimate artifacts that are out there, and then introducing deceptive artifacts. But it's solely based on what's learned from the organic changes that take place naturally in the organization, and not necessarily based on a predefined algorithm that makes a series of assumptions.
Wonderful, Chad. We had one more question really quickly pop in at the end of your answer, and that is, how do we as Illusive position ourselves against the competition that also promises, quote, the best deception solution?
Hey, that's a fantastic question. I think the important part here is to really understand what deception actually is. What we find in the marketplace is that there's this assumption that deception means honeypot. And there's actually many forms of deception. And deception across the spectrum. There's deception in the form of honeypot, but each form of deception has specific use cases that they exceed, that they do well in. Honeypot, for example, we have customers that want to move away from just being a consumer of threat intelligence to wanting to be a creator of threat intelligence. So there's specific strategies and placement requirements that are needed to actually accomplish that result. If you're putting honeypots deeply nested in your network, what are the chances are you're going to actually get an attacker there to begin with, and then ultimately develop that threat intelligence that you're looking to create, right? The attackers have to choose to go there. You're dealing with an attacker that's making decisions. You're not saying, hey, you go here, right? So you really have to influence the attacker in positive ways. We have other customers that are more focused on detection and removal of the adversary from the environment. And that's a different use case, and that's more focused on the endpoint. The attackers are on the endpoints. They're going to use tools, tactics, and techniques on the endpoints to make these decisions and move to different places. So you need to make sure that you're impacting their decision-making process there. so that you can then at that point capture pertinent information. The next step in deception, though, is also where you capture the intelligence that you're looking to capture. Elusive, we do a combination of all types of deceptions, but we're very aggressive at the endpoint. So what that means for you guys is that we're going to capture forensic information in the attacker's natural environment. There's no room for suspicion. It's completely unavoidable. So that forensic information is captured not only at the endpoint, full snapshot of the machine based on everything that the attacker is doing. You can extract valuable IOCs and TTPs in a natural environment, so the attacker can't be suspicious of the environment. And then at that point, we can also capture that on the destination side, which is at the decoy side, right? Which is where your traditional honeypots would sit there and record things. But it's very important. It really depends. If these things are optional, you can choose which way you want to go based on your priorities. If you really want to solve for lateral movements in a really meaningful way, then you have to be really, really strong at the endpoint. And again, you can't get threat intelligence if you don't have detection. So those things, honeypots are additive to a strong endpoint strategy. Now, you're going to also leverage deceptions in terms of how you apply them to different environments. It makes sense to, if you have things that are, for example, exposed to the public that's going to get you attention, you want to make sure that you can craft deceptions that speaks the language of that environment. That can be automated, but you can also use some data that you've crafted yourself to embed that in your applications, for example. So there's lots of ways to use deceptions, but it's all based on strategy, and it's based on what means most to the organization in terms of what you're trying to do. And many of our customers choose to focus on detection, prevention and isolation, and ultimately removal of the attacker. And then we do have a few customers here and there that are very interested in the intelligence side of things. And so that's a different use case, and that's additive to the detection use case. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much for that answer, Chad. Everyone who attended, this webinar was recorded, and a recording will be sent to you first thing tomorrow. Thank you all for your time. JB, thank you so much for joining us and presenting your insights. We very much appreciate it. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. Thank you all.